Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome back to Genesis class. Go ahead and take your Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 10. We're going to start there this morning, although we're probably not going to stay there too long, given that it's another genealogy, but it's important that we study these things. And as you guys are turning there, I'll go ahead and briefly review what we talked about in the last lesson. Over the last two lessons, we talked about Noah. And we talked, or I guess the last three lessons, we've been talking about Noah. And we talked about how God saw him, and he was the only one that Noah was the only one that pleased God. And God had already determined that he was going to give mankind 120 more years before he destroyed the world with a flood. That's how long mankind had to repent of their evil, which had filled the earth, God says in Genesis chapter 6. Noah built his ark following God's specifications. God brought the animals to Noah and then shut them all up in the ark and then destroyed the entire world with a flood. When they got out, Noah offered sacrifices which pleased God, and so God made a covenant with Noah, promising that he would never again destroy the world with water. Now we understand that the world will one day be destroyed again, as we read in the book of Revelation, but we see that it is by fire. And certainly that was not, God's promise was not to stop flooding, period. Floods still occur, we understand that today. Recently we had several hurricanes come through down in the south part of the United States, and there was flooding. And so if we were to say, well, God promised he would never cause any floods, and this is also where we understand that this was a worldwide flood, because if God had promised there would be no more floods like the one he had just sent, it was just a local flood, well then God's word is not true, because we still see local floods all the time. But God promised Noah that he would never destroy the whole world again with a flood, and at this point mankind is also given the ability to eat meat, and also God establishes once and for all the value of a human life. He talks about if an animal was to take a human life, that animal was to be put down. That animal's life was to be taken from it. And if a human were to take another human's life, that human would also lose his life. His life would be taken from him. And so we now have value given, and that value for human life, the only thing that could pay for a human life was human life. There's nothing on earth that is the equivalent. And then we saw how even though Noah did find grace in God's sight, Noah was a man of righteousness, a preacher of righteousness. I believe it's the book of 2 Timothy calls him. I can't remember exactly which book it is, but one of the epistles calls him preacher of righteousness. Even though he'd found grace in God's sight, even though he was counted righteous by God, he still had that sin nature. He was still a sinner, and he fell into the sin of drunkenness, which then caused his son also fell into sin. We're not sure what sin precisely, but it was enough that when Noah came out of his drunkenness, he cursed Ham through his son. And so now we have sin still being in this world. God had stripped away most of humanity, but the sin problem is still there. And it's going to be many, many more years before the sin problem is dealt with on the cross. So at this point, Noah and his family are off, and they start to obey God's command to replenish the earth. So in Genesis chapter 10, we have the generations of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them sons were born after the flood, and it goes through and it lists all these names of the descendants from each of these sons. So we first are given Japheth descendants, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, and Meshach, and Tiras, and so on and so forth. It says in verse 5 of Genesis 10, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their land, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. So Japheth's descendants would become the Gentiles, which most scholars interpret that to essentially mean the Europeans. We believe through the genealogies that have been recorded that a lot of Japheth's descendants would end up going into after the dispersion, which we'll talk about in Genesis 11. they would end up going into Europe, and they would establish the European descendants through there. Then we have the descendants of Ham. Remember, Ham's son Canaan is cursed. Ham's sons are Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, and Canaan. And these end up being the Canaanites, which are going to give issues to Israel throughout much of their history. It talks about, let's see here. Under Canaan it says, and Canaan begat Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgasite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zamorite, and the Hamathite, all the ites, which are later on in the book of Exodus. God is going to call upon the children of Israel to push them out of what he would call the promised land. Also, we believe that the Egyptians came from, let's see here, I got to go back. Where did Mitzrayim go? There he is, the son of Ham, Mitzrayim. We believe the Egyptians were descended from him. So the Canaanites, or the Hamites, moved from wherever Noah's Ark was during the dispersion. They would have moved south into Palestine, Egypt, and then eventually down into Africa. And then Shem's descendants, these would continue on the promised line of Seth. You have we're going to look at Shem's descendants a little bit later on, because his genealogy is actually repeated in Genesis 11. But the Shemites, we believe, mostly stayed in the area after the dispersion, which I keep referencing because it is going to be a pivotal moment in mankind's history. But the Shemites would have stayed kind of in the area, in the Fertile Crescent area, that area in what we now know as modern-day Iraq, and Syria, as well as Jordan and some of those places. And some of them would have also moved down into modern-day Palestine as well. And even, we think, some also potentially moved eastward. And it is entirely possible that some of these descendants of Shem made it all the way as far as the Americas at some point, although we don't know 100% for sure. But we do know that there have been people living in the Americas for many millennia, and so they would have had to come from somewhere, and so we believe they either came from Shem or possibly Japheth as well. And so we have these long genealogies that God puts in here. This one is not as thorough, perhaps, as some of the previous ones, and it's not going to be as thorough as the one that we see in chapter 11 for Shem. God just kind of gives out some names, and basically this kind of points out, this passage is mostly meant to point out, here's where some of these people that we're going to see later on in the Bible, here's where they come from. Okay, and it points out how all mankind essentially comes from one family. Now we understand that all mankind comes from Adam and Eve, but after the destruction of the world, at this point, all the peoples of the world come from Noah. And so all of mankind is related. And I find that to be a very interesting thought, that all of mankind is related, because if you think through all of the conflicts in world history, and if you think through some of the philosophies that have come through about how some men are considered better than others, I think of Nazi Germany, where they claimed that you had certain groups of people who were considered superior than other groups of people, and some groups of people have even been considered subhuman. It all clearly goes against the Bible, because everyone comes from the same family.
Amen.
We're all descended from the same three people.
True.
And so we can't look at another human being and say, oh, well, they're somehow less of a human being, because they had the same heritage as everyone else. And so if I'm going to look at one human being and say, well, this person is somehow less, well, then essentially I'm saying that I myself am less, because we all came from the same family tree. And understand at this point that the line of Cain has essentially been eradicated. Now we don't know the descendants of the wives of Noah's sons, of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and it is possible that, as we saw in Genesis chapter 6, that perhaps one of them had taken a wife from the line of Cain. But as far as a pure line of Cain, that ungodly line, that line that separated from God, previous to the flood, that line has been completely eradicated. Some notable individuals, though, as we look through here. The first one is Nimrod. We see him in. I should have put the verse down for him. 8, thank you. Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Nimrod is going to very likely be a key figure here shortly. He starts essentially the kingdom of Babel. He is a mighty one. Now this goes back to, if you remember in Genesis 6, we talked about there being mighty men on the earth, and the Nephilim, the giants. And the word that's used for mighty men back in Genesis chapter 6 is the same one here. So it doesn't necessarily refer to necessarily his physical strength. It also could be referring to his, I guess you could say, political strength. He was a tyrant, essentially. That word is used. Tyrant could be used to describe what a mighty man was as well. He was not a good person. He was, in fact, we're going to see later, his people are going to rebel against God. And then Peleg is also mentioned. We'll actually talk about him a little bit later because he's mentioned again in Genesis 11. But it talks about in verse 25, Eber was born 2 sons. I lost my place. The name of one was Peleg, for in his day the earth was divided. We'll talk about that a little bit later, and the ramifications of why God specifically mentions Peleg, the earth being divided in his day. And you'll notice in Genesis 10, it talks about each time, after it talks about the sons of Japheth, Ham, and Shem, it says at the very end of each section, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. And then in verse 31, it says the same thing. These are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. And then we come into Genesis chapter 11, and it's going to explain where all of this came about and why these people divided the way that they did. And so you could think of Genesis 11 as almost being an explanation for Genesis chapter 10. So let's take a look at Genesis 11. We're going to start in verse 1. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And this is why I say chapter 11 is an explanation for verse 10, because it talks about how there's more than one language in chapter 10. Each one of these nations, or each one of these families, is divided by their tongues. But then in verse 11 it says the earth was of one language. So that's why I believe God then stops where he was talking about the descendants of Shem. He then stops and says, all right, let's explain where these tongues came from. Let's explain where these nations came from. And then after all this, he's then going to go back to the genealogies. The whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east. Okay, so they're going from the east somewhere else. They're journeying. They found a plain in the land of Shinar. Again, that's that Fertile Crescent area, modern-day Iraq. Somewhere close to where, if you were to look on a modern map today, where Baghdad is. And they dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So originally mankind was united under one language. That should make sense. They're one family. They all came from one family that had been established on the boat. No other languages that we know of have come up at this point. And so everyone's speaking the same language. We don't know what language that is. Some people speculate on the different kinds of languages it might have been. We don't know if it's still a language that is spoken today or if it's a language that has long since died. We just simply don't know. It could be, it could not be. But what's plain here is that they all speak the same language. And by speaking the same language, that's going to cause them to focus together as one unit, and they settle in the land of Shinar, which, if you know your geography, would make sense. Shinar, again, that's that area of Mesopotamia. It's called the Fertile Crescent for a reason. Stuff grows really well there. And so when you're fresh off the boat and you're looking for a place to settle, Shinar is not too far away from where the mountains of Ararat are, if we understand our geography correctly. And so it makes sense as they move away from the ark, as they're looking for a place to settle, this area where there's two rivers is going to make a lot of sense. Stuff is going to grow easily there. They can build a great civilization. They can start rebuilding mankind and replenish the earth with man right there. And that makes sense. But unfortunately, we have to understand that this is somewhat contrary to what God had said. In chapter 9, he talks about be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Okay, and here mankind is trying to settle into one place. Now, initially, I'm guessing this wouldn't have been a problem. Obviously, if it's just Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, their wives, and a few of their children, they're not going to scatter too far. But as population grows quickly, they're not going to want to. They're going to need to spread out. They should be spreading out. But they're not. They decide as a unit, as a people, we're going to settle in one spot. Now, I don't know how many people there were at this point. Mankind has a tendency to repopulate rather quickly. I was doing some math it's interesting how many school subjects you have to use when you're going through the Bible. The Bible truly is a book for everything. And I was going through how long mankind was on the earth by the time the flood came around, and I went through the math of how many people how the earth's population has grown in the same amount of time in the modern period. I want to say it was about 1,500 years between the time of Adam and Eve and the time of the flood. It was about that much time. And if you calculate in the modern era, or you actually have to go back to the medieval period, from about 500 to modern day, the Earth's population has exploded from 100 million, we estimate. Nobody actually knows how many people were on the Earth in AD 500, but we estimate about 100 million people. From 100 million people, we're now at 7.7 billion. That's a lot. That's a big change. We're talking about a population growth of 70-fold. Oh. And that's in 1,500 years. Now, bear in mind that previous to the flood, people lived a whole lot longer. Yeah. So it was entirely likely that the Earth was full of a lot more than just 7 billion people. Now, maybe maybe there were fewer humans, maybe they reproduced slower, I don't know. But if humans haven't changed all that much post-flood, I mean, we're talking billions of people previous to the flood, and this event, the Tower of Babel, doesn't seem to take too long after Noah and his family get off the ark, but clearly there's enough people at this point that they can build an entire city. Yeah. So mankind is reproducing quite quickly, and they get together in this one place in Shinar where there's plenty of farmland to grow food, to sustain a population that's large enough for a city. So then they say, let's build a city and let's build a tower. And this tower is erected in opposition to God. Now understand that this area is called Babel. Okay, it's going to be called that a little bit later. And we've already seen who the leader of Babel is, Nimrod. Now some historians have speculated that Nimrod is actually leading the people at this point. The Bible does not straight up say, but it does talk about him being a mighty man, which could be interpreted as a kind of ruler or a tyrant. And so it is possible here that Nimrod is setting himself up as kind of an emperor or a king, and the people then say, let's build this tower in rebellion to God. The purpose of this notice is to say they don't want to be scattered. They very specifically say, let us make a name lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. They don't want to be scattered. They want to stay united as one people group, and certainly I can understand that. As a personal human being myself, we like the idea of maintaining a close nation, as we like having our identity as a people group, so I can understand that, but this was contrary to what God had told them to do. They were supposed to replenish the earth, but they say, no, we're going to stay in this one area. Now I suppose eventually as the population had grown, they would have had to have spread out, and they could have replenished the earth that way. but that was not God's intention. And certainly, you could see the rebellion where they talk about building the tower reaching unto heaven, which reminds me of what we saw in Ezekiel with Satan's fall, where he tried to attain the throne of the Most High. Now, I don't think that these people were idiots. I don't think they were thinking they could actually build a tower to reach heaven. I don't think that was their purpose. But the idea is if they build a tower, they can essentially set up their own kingdom. They can set up their own system of rule that doesn't depend on God. They are essentially trying to replace God with their own throne. Similar to how Lucifer attempted to overthrow God by setting himself up as equal to the Most High. That is the same kind of attitude that I'm seeing here. I don't think they literally thought we're going to build a tower in outer space and try to build it all the way to heaven. Okay, but the intention is clear. They're rebelling against God. And so this tower was to be a symbol of that rebellion against God. And it's going to be interesting. As you look through world history, you're going to see towers reaching to heaven throughout all of world history. We believe that this tower that they built here is what we call a ziggurat, which is kind of like a pyramid, but it's like a pyramid, but it's more like a layer cake, where each layer gets shorter and shorter as you go up to the top. And throughout Babylonian culture, you see these ziggurats everywhere, where they have these layers with steps leading up to the top, and usually at the top of these ziggurats would be some kind of sanctuary where they would place an idol or where a king would sit. And the only way you could go up to meet the god or the king sitting on top, you had to climb up all these stairs, and there were certain limits that you could go. Certain people could not go higher than a certain level unless they met certain criteria. They were, maybe they were priests, and they could only advance to a higher level as they advanced through the orders of their priesthood, or nobles or things like that, as they would go up to the king. And so we see that all throughout world history and world cultures. Did you have something?
Yeah, it's a picture of God in heaven, and man is putting him in between. Man is putting himself, the king is putting himself, so that people have to walk up to him and not see. It's a picture, but it's the wrong picture.
Yeah. No, he was, in case the camera didn't pick it up, he was saying that it was mankind setting himself between his fellow man and God, and the only way to approach God was to go through this other man, and that's also true. And we're going to see that in world religions as well. You have the pyramids in Egypt, you have the Mayan step pyramids in South America. You're going to have similar structures, towers and pagodas and things in the Far East. And they all come, it is amazing just how many connections there are in world culture, because we all come from the same people.
Yes.
We're all one giant family. Yeah, we do things differently. The Mayan pyramids don't look that similar to Egyptian pyramids, and certainly the pagodas don't look anything like the others, but they all served the same purposes. They were an attempt to set mankind up in the place of God, and to put a man in between the common people and God himself. And there are cultures and religions today where they may not build towers, physical towers, but there are spiritual towers. Yeah. There's a spiritual hierarchy in a lot of religions where the only way you're going to be able to go to God is to either work your way up through the ranks and achieve that highest position yourself, or else you have to use that higher position as a go-between. Whether it's a high priest or a pope or anything like that, they're setting themselves up as a spiritual tower. And that all comes all the way back to here. I was, a long time ago, I was watching through a video series, and it was talking about these connections in the culture, in the cultures all around the world, and how you have all of these similarities. And it was amazing to just see how some of these religions that you don't think, you look at them on the outside and you're like, wow, these are nothing similar. But then you delve a little bit deeper into what they believe, and it's fundamentally the same thing. The names are different, the people are different, but the belief is fundamentally the same, and you end up with two religious groups. You have the religious group of the people who follow the Bible, the Christians and those Jews who actually follow after the Bible, and then you have everybody else. And they may claim to be different, and many of these other faiths will fight each other as well, but ultimately they all believe in the same thing. And it's fascinating to see, and it all comes back to this point. The leader was likely Nimrod, as I mentioned in chapter 10, verse 9, him being a mighty hunter before, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad. And these countries, these nations, these cities that are set up are going to be in direct opposition throughout Scripture to God's people. They're going to become the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are going to be the ones who are directly set up to oppose God in the Scriptures. And God, though, is going to use them. It's fascinating to think that you have all of these world governments and all of these people and world religions who hate God, and yet God is the one who is using them. God used Babylon eventually to punish the nation of Israel, but also to set up Israel to be prepared for the coming of the Messiah. God set up Persia to do the same thing, and Rome to do even more. Rome would be the government who they opposed God clearly, and throughout Rome's history persecuted those who followed God, but God would use them to make it easier for the gospel to spread. And despite how many times they tried to stop the spread of the gospel, their own public works, their roads, their unified language, that would cause the gospel to be spread much faster. And it all goes back to this one moment. We, of course, would say that the most pivotal moment in human history is the coming of Christ. But certainly as we read through the Bible, we can see certain of these events that have altered the course of history in ways that still have repercussions to this day. And that's just amazing for me to think about. And it's one of the reasons why I love history. I love making those connections and seeing them. So they set up this tower. They start building this tower to rebel against God. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So God sees them building this tower, and of course in His infinite wisdom and His infinite knowledge, He knew this was going to happen. This did not catch Him by surprise. And in a manner, the language that God uses here reminds me of the language He used when He was throwing Adam and Eve out of the garden, where the whole idea of throwing them out of the garden was to keep them from attaining eternal life, because that would have completely ruined the fellowship between mankind and God, because there would have been no way for man there would have been no way for man's sin to have been paid for if mankind was immortal, because the wages of sin is death. The only way to pay for sin is through death, and if mankind was immortal, they wouldn't have been able to pay the sin debt. And so God forced them out for that reason. And I almost get kind of a similar thing here. God is doing this not because He's being cruel or vindictive or in some way feels slighted. It's almost, what I read from the tone here is that He's preventing them from making an even bigger mistake. They've already made one mistake, and if they are to continue, they're going to make an even bigger mistake. What that is, we don't know. But God says they're going to be, whatever their imagination is, they'll be able to do it, so we're going to confound their language, so they can't understand each other. And this is one of those points that a lot of men of science will get stuck on. A lot of scientists reject God partially because of this. And you think about how much these supposed men of science hate religion because it has held mankind back. And sometimes they'll come to this and they'll say, if God hadn't confounded the language, just think of where mankind would be today. If we could all communicate. Well, sure. Think of the depravity we would be in. I mean, we're seeing a culture today where the language is becoming reunified. It is so easy now to either learn another language, or the fact of the matter is, most people are learning English, and people want to learn English. That is the language that is most commonly spoken throughout the world. It used to be French, which I find interesting, but English has taken over that language, and it's rapidly being followed by Arabic as the Islamic world spreads. And so you have these two languages that are unifying people at a very quick rate. And just think of all the technological advancements that we've seen over the last decade even. I mean, I still remember when internet wasn't a thing.
That's right.
I mean, it was a thing, but you couldn't,
No, it wasn't.
it wasn't for the common people. You know, my dad spoke of this internet that he worked with. And us at home were like, we had a computer, but you know, you could use it for typing a Word document, and that was about it. And just think, in the last 20, 30 years, how far we've come and how technology has advanced leaps and bounds, to the point now where people are getting dissatisfied because technology isn't advancing rapidly enough. You know, the latest iPhone is not that much different than the one before it, and people are getting upset about it because we need more, we need greater. And so we're having these great technological advancements, but is our world really any better for it?
No.
I would say no. Information is being spread at a faster rate than it ever has before, but I don't think it's made us better as a people.
No.
I would say it's made us worse as a people, and I think that's what God's intention was when he confused the language, was he was preventing mankind from making an even bigger mistake than they had already made by building this tower. And so he confuses their language and he scatters them abroad. The people are then divided based on language. And this is where I truly believe some of the first, we're going to see throughout world history that things like racism are going to be a problem with mankind. And as I said, it should not be, because we're all stemmed from one family. But if you think about it, we all like to categorize ourselves in certain ways. You know, well, you know, I dress this way, or I have this income, so therefore I'm not going to associate with people who are from different incomes. Or I live in this certain area of the world, and I'm only going to associate with people from that. And we see that right here. The people are divided based on language. Now, I'm sure in the beginning it was based on convenience. You obviously wanted to be with people who could understand you. But I'm also, given mankind's wicked heart, that they also start looking down on each other. Well, you don't speak this language, so we don't like you. We don't want to associate with you. And so mankind divides itself. I'm sure if they had truly, I mean, think about all the languages that are spoken today, and yet how easy it is to learn other languages. I'm sure if there had been a true heart of unity amongst them, they could have figured it. They could have figured things out. But they divide themselves. They separate themselves, and they push themselves away. And the people are scattered abroad upon the face of all the earth. But let us not forget that it was the Lord that did that.
Amen.
He was the one who confounded the languages, and that's where we have all these different languages today. And one of the things that I often have students ask me when I come to this is, you know, was English one of those languages? No. English is a relatively new language. It comes from all kinds of different languages. It's interesting reading Old English and Anglo-Saxon, and trying to figure out what they're saying, because a lot of their words, it was actually easier to understand Danish than it is to understand Anglo-Saxon, which is, languages are fascinating. I think they're so much fun to study. But so again, we don't necessarily know exactly which languages people split up into, but it's fascinating to think that the languages that God divided the people into, those languages then got divided further and further and further into sub-languages and dialects, and to the point where two people can live in the same exact country and be speaking almost two completely different languages, just because of how far this division ended up going. It didn't stop with just what God had divided the languages here into. New languages kept sprouting as the people divided further and further and further out, until we have all of the languages that we have today. Now, possibly this is where we come to Peleg. Now, if you remember him back in chapter 10, talked about in his day was the earth divided. And so it is entirely possible that this division that is referred to by Peleg's name is this division of the people across the planet. Others say that there is a theory out there that before the flood, the earth was one continent, a supercontinent. The Pangea theory is what it's called. And that after the flood, because of the breaking open of the fountains of the deep and the sudden tectonic shifts within the earth's crust, that these supercontinents started dividing into the 7 continents we have today. I don't know. I wasn't there.
Yeah.
It wasn't really recorded. So it is entirely possible that Peleg's name could be referring to a actual physical division of the earth into the 7 continents that we have today. Or it could just simply be a reference to the people dividing up because of their languages. Either one I find acceptable. I can see where people come up with the idea of a supercontinent. I don't think it's necessarily unbiblical to think of it that way. But I also see nothing wrong with understanding that this could just be a reference to the division of the people. So then God moves away from this parenthetical and gets back to the genealogy in verse 10. These are the generations of Shem, and he starts going through the ages again. So in chapter 10, we're not given the ages of the different people, of the different generations, of the different people who headed these generations. But back in 11:10, we start seeing these ages again, and we start seeing that mankind's lifespan gets dramatically shorter. Previous to the flood, you had Methuselah, who lived to be 969. It was not uncommon for people to reach the age of 900. But then after the flood, we start seeing very shorter lifespans. Shem lives 500 years.
Right.
Or he lives 600 years, excuse me. Arphaxad, his son, lives 450, or 400 and, no, sorry.
530.
403 plus 53, 456 years. 456 years. Selah lives 433. Eber lives 473. Okay, so within 1 or 2 generations, mankind's lifespan gets cut in half. Just after one event where people were living 900 years or more before the flood, mankind's lifespan is cut in half. They're living a lot shorter. And then as you keep getting further down, you have Peleg, who only lived 239 years. And then moving on to Serug, who was the father of Nahor, 230 years. And then you have Nahor, who lives, he's Abraham's grandfather. He lives 29, 119. He lives 138 years. So now we're starting to come into modern day man's lifespan. Not that modern man has lived 138 years, but certainly we see people living past 100 years, but no more than that. And then it comes to Terah, Abram's father. He ends up, I can't remember how long he lives, I don't think it's listed in here. There we go, 205 years. 205 years, and then he dies. And then we get into Abraham. So within the span of only a few hundred years, mankind's life goes from 900 plus years to 200. And there have been many theories surrounding as to why. My theory is just that was God's plan.
Yes.
That with the division of the languages, mankind would not be unified together, and with mankind's shorter lifespan, man would have less time to get into trouble. I could be wrong. The Bible does not specifically state. Some people say that there are some people, the people who prescribe to the canopy theory, say that now that the canopy is gone, the sun's radiation causes more diseases to occur in man's body, that man's body decays a lot faster than it did because it's new exposure to the sun's radiation, and so that's why they're dying faster. Other people say that because of, with the flood destroying most of the life, all of the rotting carcasses and things that would have been left behind by the flood would have caused a whole host of new diseases to come forth, shortening man's lifespan. There's a whole lot of theories. The fact is, man is no longer able to live as long as he once had. Mankind has gotten even further from perfection at this point. So then we have this man Terah, who is a descendant of Shem. As I said, Shem's line would carry on that godly line of Seth and lead to the birth of the Messiah that would redeem the world. By the way, is the area where Babel is. So it would seem that these descendants of Shem, in spite of the languages being confused, they stayed in the area. This would be the area that they would maintain as their home. And then Terah ends up leaving out of this land, and he takes them north. Okay, so this is about where Babel is. Those of you on the camera, I have a map over here. And you have where modern day Ur is, close to where where the Persian Gulf is today. And so then Terah would have taken his family up and taken them into modern day Syria, basically back towards Asia Minor where the ark was. And Terah's going to settle in that area of Syria, and there he's going to die. And at this point we are introduced to Abram and Sarai. And this is where you have now a division point. You could say that Genesis 1 through 11 is part 1 of Genesis. We don't really focus too much on individuals. There are individuals mentioned certainly. But the point of Genesis 1 through 11 is a broad early history of man. You have individuals who are mentioned of note: Noah, Adam and Eve, Cain, Seth. But it's largely just painting a picture of how the world was before the flood. We now come post-flood, we have the Tower of Babel, and now, instead of focusing on the whole world, God is going to zoom in the rest of the book on one family. And that's going to be the family of Abram, and that's where we're going to be spending the rest of our time in this book, is looking at Abraham and his descendants. So we'll start part 2 tomorrow. Or sorry, not tomorrow, next week. I would love to start it tomorrow. We'll have to wait till next week, and we'll zoom in on this one family that God has decided he would use to bring forth the coming Messiah.